Snow fell in the godswood as if it had always been falling, as if the whole world were nothing but winter and quiet breath. John stood beneath the weirwood and watched the wind comb the red leaves until they shivered like damp banners. The face in the trunk stared as it had stared in his boyhood, mouth split by the slow knife of centuries, eyes bleeding sap as if the tree remembered hurts it had never known. Ghost moved through the flakes without sound, a pale ripple between trunks, the only white thing that did not belong to the snow. When John held out his hand, the dire wolf stepped from branches and shadow and pressed his head into John's palm, warm as bread just pulled from an oven. John scratched the soft place behind one ear. Ghost's breath came slow and steady, a hearth inside the cold. "We have time yet," John murmured, not certain whether he meant it for the weirwood, for the fallen snow, or for the thing that watched him from the emptiness beyond the trees. Ghost did not answer, but his red eyes lifted to the face carved in the bark, and for a heartbeat John had the childish sense that the three of them were the only living beings that mattered: man, wolf, and witness. Boots crunching on the path broke the spell. Davos Seaworth came into the godswood with his shoulders hunched and his gloves tucked under his arm, fingers bare as if he had needed to feel the winter to trust it. He bowed his head to the heart tree, more out of courtesy than faith, then to John. "They're waiting in the great hall," Davos said. "You'll want to hear what the red woman brought with her." John felt Ghost's muscles shift. The direwolf's left ear twitched, catching Davos's voice and the voices behind it. The small iron music Winterfell made when men were afraid and tried to mask it. "She's come back to gloat?" John said, but there was no bite to it. He had seen too much death to waste his anger on priests. "She's come back for you," Davos said quietly. In his mouth the words had no flourish. They were a length of rope thrown across an icy stream. "Best we get on with it." John followed him out beneath the dripping branches. Ghost padded to his right, close enough that John could feel the brush of fur against his thigh through the wool. The keep woke in 100 small ways as they passed. Someone dropped a bucket, a boy laughed too loudly and then hushed himself with both hands. A pair of women bickered over onions as if the right answer would keep the dead from hearing them. The air held a sour, brassy hint of cold iron and old blood. Overhead, a raven lifted and then settled again with a displeased rattle of wings, as if the bird could smell the change coming and found it boring or inevitable. Melisandre stood near the far hearth in the great hall, her red silk at odds with the thick stone and the sweat-dark furs. The flames gilded her throat and turned her hair into a living thing. Daenerys stood beside her, no crown, hands folded, expression so composed it looked like a mask. Sansa sat in the high seat with one hand on the arm carved like a wolf's hill-broken shoulder. Arya leaned in shadow near the pillars. Bran's chair had been rolled near the high table, the boy's eyes as unblinking as the heart trees. There were others. Tormund smelling of horse and snow, Gendry with his powerful hands clean for once, Sam off to one side with a sheaf of papers clutched like a shield. The hall hummed with the attention of a hive. "You cannot keep it from him," Melisandre said to no one in particular when John entered. "The truth is a blade. It will cut who it must." "I'm weary of blades," John said, voice flat. "Speak your truth then, if it's a truth at all." "It is older than your house," Melisandre said. "Older than the roots under your godswood. Once, when the world needed saving and men were only men, a warrior found the forge could not give him the sword he needed. Twice he made a blade. Twice it failed. On the third attempt, he drove the blade into the living heart of the one he loved best, and the steel drank the fire of that life. The sword woke with light. John listened, old lessons signifying like distant campfires. "Nissa, Nissa," he said. "So the tale goes." "The tale goes still," Melisandre said. "But tales are a river. They take new turns and return to old beds. The prophecy does not name the beloved. It names only the cost and the waking. We mistake specificity for safety." He felt Davos looking at him and refused it. "You have a point." "The point is upon you," Melisandre said. "The others will not wait for more legends. They are on the move. Your walls will not hold. Dragonfire is not enough. The sword that wakes must be forged. The heart that breaks must be given. Daenerys, who had said nothing, said now calmly, "You speak as if I stand here to be butchered, for your fire and your God." Melisandre's face did not move, but something in her gaze softened. "I speak as if the world cannot be saved by one woman's life, even a life such as yours, nor by a man's pride, nor by our comfort." Her eyes slid to Ghost for the first time, and Jon felt the direwolf lean into him without moving. "The heart in question is not always human." "No," Arya said from the pillar, as if she had come across a stranger with his hand in her pocket. "No, don't," Sansa said, not to Melisandre but to the moment itself. Sam's papers rustled. He pushed spectacles higher on his nose. "There are other versions," Sam said. There are mentions, not exactly versions, in some of the older records. The Ahai call it the third tempering, and in one account, the beloved is described not as a wife or woman but as the companion of the soul. The words are softened by translation, but the sense is that the sword drinks what completes the warrior. The bond is what makes the metal true. "Your wolf completes you," Melisandre said, and Jon felt the room tilt around its center. "Burn in your own flames," Davos said between his teeth. "If there's a sword to be made, let it drink the heart of a priest." "It would make a sword of ash," Melisandre said. "You may hate me for the pity I cannot give you. I have none that would help." Ghost's head came up, unhurried. The wolf sniffed once, twice, as if testing the air, and then he settled again. Jon put his hand on the ruff of Ghost's neck and did not trust himself to speak. It would have been easier if Melisandre had been cruel, easier even if she had begged. Her certainty left no enemy he could strike. "We've tried," Gendry said suddenly, flushing under their attention. "The steel they brought from Dragonstone, the dragonglass we folded in. I can make a blade that cuts. Cannot make it burn. I cannot make it wake." "Maybe it doesn't need to wake," Tormund put in. "Maybe we just need enough sharp metal and your queen's big lizard." He jerked his chin at Daenerys without insult. "Burn them and cut what doesn't burn." Bran spoke then, without turning his head. "He will have to choose." Sansa's hand tightened on the carved wolf until her knuckles whitened. "We are not doing this in the hall like a market argument," she said. "We will speak again tonight, after we hear from the scouts." "They are on the move," Melisandre had said, and the words proved true. The scouts returned at dusk with frost in their beards and terror like candle smoke clinging to them. The dead had left a trail even the blind could follow. A long band of black ice across the barrows and the broken fields north of Winterfell. They ate sound like a blanket eats heat. They carried with them a chill that made old men weep without knowing why. By the time the last of the scouts had spoken, night had taken the yard and laid a hand on the heart of the keep itself. Jon ate stew he could not taste, sitting with Ghost near the fire. He felt every eye that tried not to look at him. He carried each as if it were a pebble in his boot. Daenerys sat with Missandei and Yora, their quiet forming a precise circle of civility around them. Arya disappeared and reappeared like the shadow of a lantern. Sansa spoke with the quartermaster, then a smith, then old Maester Wolkan, her voice steady and practical, the way a winter river is steady and practical as it moves beneath ice. Sam read by the hearth until the letters swam, and he put the pages down and stared at the flames as if they were a different kind of book. When Jon rose, Ghost stood at once, a pale echo, and together they slipped from the hall. In the courtyard, the cold bit at his cheeks. There was a promise in the stars, a brittle glitter that had nothing to do with hope. Jon crossed the yard and went up to the battlements. The wind hit him like a thrown bucket. He leaned into it until it carried him a little, a boy's trick remembered by an older body. Far north, beyond where sight failed, he felt the presence he had felt in the Godswood and in the hall. A pressure, a quiet, an absence like a swallowed word. He could leave, he thought, with a sudden hunger that shame did not dull. He could take Ghost and a good horse, ride clear of the army and the prophecies, go to the Skirling Pass or the Frostfangs, live like a shadow cat until the world did what it would do without him. He could be small and unimportant and warm for a while. Ghost pressed his flank against John's knee. The dire wolf tilted his head and made a sound that was not a whine and not a growl. A low note like the first part of the word no. John put his hand in the rough again and felt the life in it, as if he were warming his fingers at a fire he had built himself. "I know," he said to the wolf, to the sky, to the thing that had his name on its tongue. "I know." They found him in the God's Wood at midnight because he had gone there without deciding to go, in the way a thirsty man finds a stream. Melisandre came through the snow as if she did not touch it. Davos and Sam followed, unwilling conspirators. Gendry carried a long bundle wrapped in oiled cloth. Bran's chair was pushed by Podrick Payne, who looked sad and puzzled in equal measures, as if he had been sent on a fool's errand and had decided the only answer was to perform it perfectly. Arya materialized from the birches, hair rimed with frost. Sansa came last, cloaked in gray, her face carved of the same patience as the heart tree. Daenerys came, too, hands bare, eyes luminous, Drogon a black mountain above the treetops in the dark. He huffed smoke like an exhausted candle, the steam of his breath fogging the leaves and icing the grass where it touched. The gods would made room around him reluctantly, branches creaking, snow shedding in soft sighs. "We do this once," Sansa said. The words sounded like she had traveled a long way to bring them and had dropped the rest of her speech in the snow. "We will call no more councils. We will not keep coming back to this at every tremor or dream. If we lose him to this, we lose him. If we keep him and lose all, we lose all. I am done weighing proofs like copper pennies." "So am I," Jon said. Gendry knelt and unwrapped the cloth. Inside lay a sword like a shard of night sky, blacker than any steel Jon had ever seen, veined subtly with bands of glossy darkness. The handle had been wrapped with leather that had once been the bridle of a dead king's horse. Near the base of the blade, a line of whitish glass ran down the center like a river in drought. Dragon glass folded into steel until the two were one. Jon could not tell where it began or ended. It ate the starlight and gave nothing back. "Twice," Gendry said, not looking at him. "Twice we tempered it. Once in water. Once in the roaring mouth of Drogon's fire. It's good steel, but it's sleeping. I can feel it, like a heartbeat on the wrong side of a door." Melisandre produced no tools, no candles, no rope. "The words are unimportant," she said. "The truth happens with or without our small noises. Then save your breath and let us be done," Davos said hoarsely. Jon sank to one knee because it felt wrong to stand taller than the moment. Ghost came to him without being called. The dire wolf put his head under Jon's hand with a familiarity that broke Jon's chest. The fur was coarse and soft, both at once, the way snow is soft until you lie in it too long and your bones understand. Jon found that place behind Ghost's ear and scratched it gently. Ghost's eyes narrowed and opened again, red coins widening, and then he lifted his head and placed it against Jon's sternum as if he had done it 100 times in 100 nights. Jon bowed his head until his forehead touched Ghost's and the world narrowed to breath. His, then the wolf's, then something quieter behind them both. In later days, Jon would remember every detail of the next moments with a clarity that embarrassed him, as if his mind refused to obscure any piece that might have allowed mercy to enter. He remembered the steam from Drogon's nostrils curling like script. He remembered the exact pattern of veins in the nearest weirwood leaf, how it looked like a map for a country no man had ever lived in. He remembered that Sam's left glove had a rip at the base of the thumb, and Sam had tried to hide it by tucking his hand under his arm, and then forgot and took it out again. He remembered Arya's mouth compressed around a thought she would not speak. He remembered Sansa's breath fogging at the corners of her hood. He remembered Davos looking at his boots because he knew there was no help in any man's eyes. He remembered Daenerys' hands open, the way she had held them when she stood on the edge of a cliff and asked the wind to tell her whether she was a queen or a girl. He remembered Bran watching as if watching were doing. "Ghost," Jon said. The name was insufficient and entire. The wolf's ears flicked. Jon laid his hand along Ghost's neck and felt the artery thrum gently against his palm. The small song of continuing. If there is a thing after this, wait for me." The direwolf's eyes did not change. Ghost breathed once, and then his tongue touched John's wrist, the lightest, briefest acceptance. And in that acceptance, John's choice stopped being something separate from the moment. He rose and took the sword from Gendry. It was deceptively light. He had known heavy swords all his life. He had won his battles with weight and practice. This blade wanted something from him that was not muscle. He moved to the heart tree, where a knot of roots made a natural altar, and he laid the blade there. Melisandre said nothing. She did not need to. The weirwood leaned over them like a parent learning to listen. Drogon's breath made the leaves hiss. The snow fell and did not fall. Jon knelt again and wrapped his arms around Ghost. He buried his face in the wolf's neck and breathed the smell of wind and cold iron and the sweetness of meat in the back of the throat. Ghost leaned fully into him, making of Jon's chest a wall, of Jon's arms a room. There was no knife he could hide. There was no cleverness. Jon drew in a breath that did not find the bottom and, without ceremony, lifted the wolf's great head and found the place where the beating was loudest. Ghost watched him without blinking. The blade slid as if it had been waiting for exactly this angle, this pressure. There was a small, wet sound, no worse than a fish pulled from a stream, and then a heat that had nothing to do with blood flared up Jon's arms. Ghost did not struggle. He shuddered. Once, a tremor that passed into Jon and became Jon's tremor. 2. Jon kept his eyes open because to close them would be a coward's prayer. He kept his eyes open and saw everything. The sap of the weirwood thickening like tears along the carved cheek, Sam's mouth forming a word and losing it, Arya's hand opening and closing at her side as if she were catching a falling knife because she could not bear to see it hit, Davos finally lifting his eyes and making himself look, Daenerys stepping forward and stopping when the wind pushed her back. Drogon made a sound like stone sliding down the inside of a mountain. It took less time than breathing. It took all the time there was. When the wolf's weight sagged suddenly against him, Jon lowered Ghost to the rootbed as gently as he had once lowered a child years ago, for a mother afraid to hold him. Ghost's body was heavy and still handmade. His fur was still fur, but his eyes looked past Jon into a place Jon could not join him. The sword on the roots woke. There was no crack like lightning, no trumpet. The black blade took a thin thread of light at first, a hair's breadth running from the tip to the guard, and then the light widened and deepened, and the color of it was not candle flame or dragonfire or sunrise. It was white, the dangerous white of cliffs over the sea, the white under the skin of the world where the marrow shows, streaked faintly with a pulse of red that came and went like breathing. The heat of it ate the snow for a yard around and made the wet roots hiss, but Jon felt a cold radiating at the same time, a clean cold that tasted like the moment you step out of grief and discover it has followed you. He reached for the sword and his hand did not blister. The hilt was warm, but not unbearably. The blade hummed faintly in his bones, and the hum was a memory of paws sliding over snow. No one spoke. No one could. The silence in the gods would now had a different center. Jon rose with the sword in his hand and stood beside the body of the wolf that had been his first home. For a moment, long enough to make a man mad. He thought he heard a panting, a steady breath, as if from just outside the veil of air. Bran's voice came from somewhere far away and very near. "The name is already in you," he said. "You need not speak it." Daenerys took a step and another. The sound of the sword made her eyes water. She reached out, not to touch, but to feel, palm hovering near the light. "It burns, but it does not burn," she said. Her voice had the wonder of a child at her first fair, and behind the wonder something like dread. "What have you done, Jon Snow?" "What I had," he said, and could say no more, because the words would have torn him if he tried to shape them into anything larger. Sansa drew breath through her teeth, a soft, fierce sound, and let it out as if she were setting down a weight at last. She knelt beside Ghost and put her hand on his flank, just once, like a lady comforting a dog for the last time as he fell asleep. When she stood, the mask she wore had a crack in it Jon had never seen. He looked at Arya and found her watching the sword, not him, the set of her jaw unusual. She had found something that could not be killed and had decided to learn its habits instead. Davos gave a rough sound that might have been a curse in another mouth and turned his face toward the wall, shoulders lifting and lowering, until he could breathe again. Sam stepped closer to the blade, fascination pushing back grief like a little boy pushing against a door too big for him. Gendry smiled without joy and wiped a hand across his mouth as if cleaning ash. Melisandre had tears on her cheeks, the only sign of her humanity Jon had seen since the nights at the wall. The tears steamed where they touched her skin, the way the god she served must steam when asked for pity. "Azor Ahai," she said, not with triumph but with funeral gravity. "The prince that was promised, the sword that wakes, it is done." "Then it's begun," Jon said, though he had not meant to say anything. The howling started as if the world had been waiting for his voice. It rose beyond the walls, miles out in the dark, one wolf and then another, and then a host of voices like iron being pulled through earth. The hairs on Jon's neck lifted. The living roof of the gods would trem. Drogon lifted his head sharply and turned it toward the sound. The dead, Jon understood, had been listening to and had adjusted their pace. They came before dawn, when everything that can be broken is most fragile. They spilled over the fields in their silence, blotting the snow. From the battlements, the first line looked like hillocks, then like the backs of 1,000 fish sliding in a river made of night. The air went thin. Fires misbehaved. Men who had spent their lives in cold felt something colder, an absence as if their bones had been scooped out by a careful spoon. Jon stood above the gate with the sword burning in his hand and felt ghost at his back so sharply he could have turned and put his palm on the direwolf's skull. He did not turn. If he turned and the wolf was not there, he would move wrongly for the rest of his life. "Loose," Sansa commanded, voice cutting cleanly through the numb, and a flight of arrows like a flock of black birds leaped into the dark. Some found purchase, some did not. The dead climbed over the dead, and then, in shapes like memories, the dead men they had been became close enough to recognize. A farmer from Wintertown, a boy Jon had trained with at Castle Black, an umber-sworn sword who had taught Arya to throw a knife, a free folk woman who had shouted insults at Jon until he had laughed. The mind cheats in terror, Jon knew, but not always. Daenerys's dragons came like storms birthed inside storms. Drogon's fire unfurled across the first ranks and turned silence into screaming and then into the chopping crackle of burning meat. The blaze pushed back the cold a little, but not enough and not for long. Regal, scarred and furious, ripped a path above the inner trench, scouring a lane that glowed peculiarly under the light of Jon's sword. "Open the gate," Jon said, and Davos, though he had 100 reasons to say no, signaled the men at the winches. The gate opened a hand's width, then 2 hands, then a door for a single man. Jon slipped through like a shadow and stepped down into the yard of night. The first wight to reach him wore a scrap of yellow scarf and still had a look of mischief, as if death amused her. Jon's sword passed through her without resistance and left a smear of light in the air, as if he had written with a coal across the world. Where the blade touched, frost shattered instead of melting. The woman fell in 2 dry pieces. He did not feel the satisfaction of killing. He felt a subtraction, precise and limited. Another came and another, and the blade drew smooth arcs and slashes and little parrying turns that had less to do with practice than with remembering a dance learned before he was born. The light made a faint sound, like breath on fur. They pressed in and were driven back, not by Jon alone but by the little geometry of a battle done correctly when there is no room for lyric. Tormund's axe across the skull. Brienne stepping, pivoting, her shield raised at the exact angle to turn a spear. Grey Worm sliding a blade up under a rib and turning it to break a spine out of habit. The dragons rewriting air into fire. Archers breathing, loosing, breathing. The dead broke around Jon the way a river makes a shape around a sharp rock and resents it. He held his ground and did not slip in the blood because there was not much blood. Most of these bodies had left their blood elsewhere. Once, in the thick of it, Jon saw a thing that was not like the others. A figure made of brittle cold, taller than a man, crowned with a particular indifference. It stood still, watching across the field, and every wight near it moved with a more deliberate assurance. as if borrowed attention steadied their stolen limbs. John took a single step toward it and felt the blade in his hand pull as if it had weighed again, as if a leash had been snapped taut. The figure's head tilted a little. The red pulse along the white of the sword brightened. A heartbeat, stronger. Ghost's breath, John thought, or the idea of it. He took another step. The figure lifted its hand in a lazy, little god gesture, and the wind came sideways like a thrown wall. Men fell. The flames along the outer trench went blue for a heartbeat and then a color John could not name. John knelt into the gust and thrust the blade down into the snow at his feet. The light bit into ice the way a hot iron bites butter, but the sound of it was not sizzle but a low, satisfied rumble like a dire wolf finding his place under a table. The wind's pressure eased around that point, bending, slipping, making room. There were cries on the ramparts. John looked up to see Arya running along the top of the gatehouse with her feet barely touching stone, knife in each hand, moving through an oncoming cluster of dead with the liquid efficiency of a person performing a task they loved and had practiced alone 100 times while the house slept. He saw Sansa at the horn, signaling, this time not with the dignity of office but with the fierce economy of a woman in a kitchen where the stew will burn if she does not turn the pot now. He saw Davos staggering up a rung ladder, cursing one of his absent fingers as if it had abandoned him in a brawl. He saw Sam on the inner stair, face white, sword bloody, still a man who would rather read, and reading had taught him how to be brave in an order of management, not fever. He saw Daenerys descend from the sky and land Drogon so close the beast's heat stung Jon's eyes, and in the split second before Drogon tore a swath through the ranks, Jon saw the Queen's expression. Something like grief at a pageant that had gone wrong and could not be mended. By dawn, if the pale lifting of the east could be called dawn, the yard was a geometry of melted trenches and black ash. The dead drew back to the line of the barrows, then a little beyond, not routed, not defeated, but recalculating as if their master had touched a piece on a board and moved it one square and then another while he decided what to do next. The living counted the missing in silence. The missing were not numbers but holes in the wall that let in weather. They wrapped the bodies they could in old banners because the white cloth they had prepared had been used and used again. They burned what they must burn. The smoke carried into the godswood and made the red leaves look bloodier than they had been at first light. Jon stood where he had stood before and after, in the place between choices, and did not sheath the sword because it did not want to be sheathed. It stood there in his hand, a very quiet, very attentive thing. The red pulse along it slowed and steadied. He found himself counting it until he realized what he was doing and stopped. "You can hate me," Melisandre said, near his shoulder. He had not heard her approach. "It will not make you smaller." "I don't hate you," Jon said truthfully. "I just wish you were wrong." "I wish nothing," she said, which was the cruelest statement he had heard all night. Sansa came and stood in front of him. Her hair was a banner, brown braided into brown. There was ash on her cheek and a small, crooked tear in the hem of her cloak where it had caught on something and she had not felt it and no one had told her. "You will not go alone," she said without preface. "To where?" His voice sounded like a man asking the way in a city where there are no maps. Arya answered from behind him. "To whoever that cold bastard is," she said. "You felt him, didn't you?" "He felt you." He saw that sword wake and decided to keep his distance. But he won't do it for long. Wolves chase. The stag runs. The lion makes a den. Some things don't change, even when they die. "Not alone," Sansa repeated. "If we send you alone, the story becomes about you. This isn't a song, Jon." She looked at the blade and then at his face. "You did what no one should have to do. You don't get to choose something noble to make up for it. You get to take what's left of us with you, and it won't be tidy." Bran's chair moved as if by its own logic and then stopped where he could see all their faces at once. "The place he is going," Bran said, softer than the light, "is not a place men have named, but there is a door north and a key that is not a key. The first men called it the Milk Cave for the color of its stone. The children had a word that meant the mouth that refuses to swallow. If you pass into it and are not meant, you vanish as if you had never stood where you stood. If you are meant and yet you are weak, you become a flatter shadow of yourself. He will be there because it is where the river of cold goes underground and then rises again in the world as dread. Do you know how to find it? Arya asked. Bran's eyes were the wrong sort of old. I do and I don't. I will when we're close. The paths change to keep the uninvited out. But wolves find them. The word hung. Jon looked down without meaning to. Ghost's body lay where they had left him last night, the snow on his pelt unmelted by the strange heat of the sword, as if the blade had already taken all there was to take and would not rob him further. He felt something stir in the air, a small pressure on his knee, the muscle memory of Aline. He kept his face steady and his hands steady and his breath in order. We'll need supplies, Davos said briskly, because briskness had saved men's lives as often as valor. Sleds, the quick-foot small lads for scouting. Ropes, oil. The dragonglass spears Gendry made that no one wanted because they prefer what they know. And mules. Mules are more trustworthy than half the men I've sailed with. Dragons, Daenerys said. At least one. Jon shook his head and surprised himself, because he wanted the reassurance of their fire as if it were bread and a bed. Not there, he said. In the cave where the path narrows, dragonfire will harm more than it helps. And he'll have kept an answer for it. He looked at her, not the way a man looks at a queen or a woman he once wanted enough to forget his caution, but the way a soldier looks at the weather. Keep them here. Weaken him from this side while we try to cut out the root. You cut out the root of a tree and you kill the tree, Daenerys said. Her gaze flicked to the heart tree and back. Sometimes that is mercy, he thought, but did not say that there is a difference between mercy given and mercy taken. He nodded. Sometimes. They made the list in that weary, practiced way people learn when grief has to share a table with logistics. Men came and went, cheeks red from cold and running. Brienne took command of a column without needing to be asked, and her nod to Sansa carried the iron of a vow. Gendry went back to his forge because the work made his thinking possible. Sam found a way to say to Jon with 2 sentences and a look that he would not let him go without something like a book for the path. He fetched old maps and rolled them carefully, because care is a kind of prayer when prayers have wronged you. Arya disappeared, and when she returned she smelled of the stables and had a different knife. Jon went to the Godswood alone once more, though he knew as he went that he was not alone. He knelt beside the body and touched Ghost's head with 2 fingers. The fur was cold now, and the cold carried no malice. I cannot ask you to forgive me, he said, and the sword in his hand hummed once as if to say that forgiveness was a human grammar and did not apply to what had happened between them. He stayed until he felt the world steady under him. When he rose, the weirwood's face seemed to have altered, not its shape but its patience. The red leaves brushed his shoulder exactly like a hand. When he left the trees, the day had rolled itself open into a pale, colorless space. The yard was busy in the way that pretends there is no fear. Scrubbed faces, quick hands, a stubborn joke about a mule's bad temper that passed as a blessing between men who hated blessings. Sansa stood at the gate with her cloak pinned properly and a knife hidden badly. She put her hand on Jon's arm and squeezed once, hard enough he would carry the mark under his sleeve for an hour. Come back with victory, she said. I will come back, he said, not because he believed he could dictate such things to the world, but because sometimes saying a thing shapes the place for it to stand. Her lips tightened as if she would say something sharp about stupid vows, but she did not. She nodded and let him go. Arya came and walked with him as far as the last stones. If he kills you, she said. I'll kill him. That would be late, he said. I have patience, she said, and did not smile. She touched the blade, quick, 2 fingers like a cat tasting. She flinched back, not from heat. It's like touching a tooth. It's like touching him, Jon said, and did not explain who he meant. At the very limit of Winterfell's shadow, a sound came to him that no one else seemed to hear. It was small and ridiculous and broke him open again just enough to feel the right grief instead of the wrong one. It was the sound of a dire wolf sneezing in his sleep because snow has touched his nose. Jon bowed his head and laughed once. A broken, secret laugh he could not have kept inside if he had wanted to. They went north. The ground tilted beneath them in long, ancient thoughts. The dips and rises of old rivers, old glaciers, old words. The sky stayed blank except where the dragons wrote briefly upon it and then erased themselves. The cold became not an enemy but a condition of the world, like hunger or age. They traveled in a geography that seemed to move slightly when they weren't looking, and stopped at places that felt used. A stand of ironwood trees where fire did not burn right. A frozen pond that sang if you struck it with a knuckle. A ring of stones black with a soot that would not wash. They slept in shifts and taught the younger boys how to listen. The second night, John dreamed that he was walking on a beach made of bones. The waves were not water but the breath of something that lived on the other side of breathing. Ghost walked beside him, head high, unimpressed. The skeletons of fish turned their empty eyes to follow the wolf. When John woke, the sword was humming gently, and his hand lay on it as if on a sleeping animal's ribcage. He looked up and found Bran watching him from across the embers. The boy nodded, as if taking attendance. On the fourth day, the wind changed. Bran straightened as if a small hook had tugged his spine. "There," he said, pointing to a bare shoulder of land where the snow hissed sideways and did not settle. John looked and saw nothing different for long minutes, and then the light shifted and a dark mouth opened in the rock, and he saw that he had been staring at it unseeing for as long as he had stood there. The sight made his eyes water. Davos muttered something about a hidden reef made of air. They approached. The dark changed size when John blinked. It was always just a little further than he expected it to be when he thought about it, and a little closer than he wanted when he let his mind go blank and felt with the part of him that knew where Ghost would step to avoid a hole under the snow. The men put ropes on themselves without being told. The mules put their heads down and became wiser than any of them. At the lip of the cave, the breath of the world came up and touched John's face. It smelled of stone and iron and something like old apples. The sword in his hand brightened slightly without flaring. The red pulse along it matched his heart for a few beats and then settled into its own measure, which was slower, steadier, and felt like a lesson he would spend the rest of his life learning if he lived long enough. "Not altogether," Bran said. "If it refuses us, we must not give it everything at once." His eyes had gone distant, white around the blue, and he shivered though he did not seem to feel the cold. "There are things inside that remember names." "Names?" Davos said bleakly. "I've too many. Keep only the one you need," Arya said, and smiled her small, knife-edged smile. John looked into the mouth that refused to swallow and had the sensation that he was looking into himself by way of another country's mirror. He took one breath and then another. The first one tasted like fear and ash. The second tasted like pine sap broken underfoot. He stepped forward. The light from the sword went out for a heartbeat as the dark closed around him, then returned in a smaller, more disciplined way, as if it had put on armor for the path. Behind him the others moved delicately, the sound of their steps muffled by stone. The cave narrowed, widened, narrowed again, its mouth a throat, its throat a choice. In places the walls were slick with a frost that did not melt under the sword's nearness. In places the rock glimmered faintly with mineral ghosts. In one hollow the ceiling curved like a human palm, and when John stopped beneath it, the blade lifted unbidden and touched the stone, and the hum deepened until he felt it in his teeth. There were carvings, too, old cuts that might have been made by stone on stone or bone on softer rock. John could not make them out. Bran passed his hand an inch from them without touching, and his breathing changed the way a reader's does when he comes to a verse he knows by heart and has found a new word in it. They came at last to a place that was not exactly a room, where the floor tilted up and stopped against a wall of rock that looked wet though nothing dripped. The air there was still, dense as cloth. John lifted the sword, and the light rode along the wet-looking surface and vanished as if swallowed. He had the nauseous sense that the wall was a skin. "He is on the other side," Bran whispered. "He has been here before. He will be here again. He is here now." "Then knock," Arya said. John lifted the sword higher. He did not strike. He pressed the flat of the blade against the skin of the wall gently, as if offering a hand to a dog that is deciding whether to bite. The wall gave, the way human skin gives, springing back a little, and then, after a moment, it did not spring back. John pushed, and the blade went in an inch, then two, then up to the hilt as if he were sliding steel into water. The light did not change. The hum grew so low it stopped being something heard and became a condition of the space. For a heartbeat, he felt a presence on the other side, recognized the touch. It turned, not in surprise, but with a kind of slow, absolute interest that made John understand in his bones what it is to be prey. And then, as if a man had opened his eyes a finger's width upon waking, a slit opened in the wall, and the air that came through was older than sorrow. John took one step forward, and he heard it again, nearer than memory and further than promise. The sound of a dire wolf breathing, patient as winter and alive as fire. He set his shoulders. He did not look back. He let the sword lead him, and he went in. The dark closed behind him with the restraint of a patient mouth. He felt it seal without noise, a lid gently lowered, and the absence of outside startled him so profoundly that he forgot to draw his next breath until the blade's hum reminded his body what was required. The light from the sword settled into a narrow halo around him, a white so dense it made its own kind of shadow. He stepped to the side to make room, and the others slipped through one by one, each of them testing the ground as if the floor might learn to be treacherous while they watched. The passage bent to the left like the inside curve of a seashell carved from winter. The air was not the cold of a camp where fire could be made. It was the old cold of a cellar that had never known a fire. At intervals, the rock showed a lichen too pale to be green, and the blade's light made it retreat into itself like flesh flinching. The hum in John's grip rose and fell with his pulse and with another measure that belonged to the sword alone. "Names," Bran said softly in the dark, and it was not a warning so much as a counting. "Keep one. Just John," Davos muttered behind him. "I've never been much for titles." "John is a title," Arya said, not unkindly. "It's a place where people look when they say your name." John said nothing. He let the blade set his pace, and he learned in 3 turns of the tunnel how it wanted to be held. Not too tightly, not the way a man grips a hand he is afraid to lose, but with the acceptance of a person carrying water carefully. Once his hip brushed the wall and his skin remembered the way ice can burn. He shifted the sword this way and that, and the light followed obediently, lapping at the stone as if seeking food it did not need. The first hazard had no body. It was a place in the tunnel where the world ended and continued again half a pace ahead. A trick of air and depth that would have taken them if the blade had not found the seam by its own curiosity. John watched the light thin, reaching out like a cat's paw testing a gap under a door, and something answered from beyond the fault with a breath like a sigh that had been frozen and then released. He stepped across. The air changed on the far side. When Davos came, cautious as a sailor feeling for a missing stair on a familiar ship, the gap showed its teeth in a glitter of frost in midair and then withdrew them again, sullen at being denied. The second hazard had bones. The floor dropped away into a black channel, and when John knelt and leaned out over the edge, the light drew out dozens of skulls along the far shelf, arranged in a line as if set for a lesson. They were not human. The jaws were too long and the teeth too even, and the bones had absorbed a faint blue like old milk. Between their smiling rows, the darkness of the channel drank the light and shifted as if something lay just beneath the surface of nothing. "How deep?" Davos asked. John held the sword out and felt it lengthen itself by inches. The light reached down and was not reflected, tasted the air and withdrew. "Farther than we want to know." They cast a rope, and the rope landed on the far shelf and lay politely until Arya went hand over hand across the gap with the speed of a small animal. She reached the far side and secured the rope around a stone that had been shaped once into a post and then forgotten. One by one they crossed, their breaths counting them, their hands making small judgments about fibers and friction. When it was Bran's turn, they made a cradle of rope for the chair, and Davos and Tormund bore the weight like men carrying a friend's coffin very carefully up a narrow stair. The chair swung a little. Bran watched the skulls pass with the expression of a boy watching rain on a window. On the far shelf, John looked back and saw that the channel had changed color beneath the rope's curve. Where the light had warmed it, The black had gone a peculiar gray, and small bubbles formed and clung and then stilled. He did not want to think about what might have woken if they had fallen in. They moved on. The passage widened into a chamber where the ceiling lifted and the walls went slick, as if someone had polished the stone with fat. Here there were carvings. They were shallow, not meant to catch shadow, cut by a tool that hadn't cared about edges. John's eyes wanted to skip across them, but the blade held steady and the lines resolved. Spirals, tight and inward turning. Concentric circles with breaks that reminded him of a mouth that would not fully close. Stick-limbed figures touching a tall shape that might have been a tree or a spear. In one panel, a group of small, round-headed people encircled a single figure taller than the rest, who seemed to carry on his back a bundle that might have been a child or a body or a part of his own shadow. Bran reached up one hand and hovered it just above the stone, and his face shifted, attention deepening, the way it had when ravens flocked toward him whether or not they were present. "Before," he said. "They made the first bargain before they made the second." "Bargains," Davos said dryly. "I've had my fill of those." "They thought winter was a map and they could choose where the rivers went," Bran went on. "They thought a shape would hold the world better than a weather. They thought if they put the cold in a vessel they could pour it out and keep the rest. But vessels get knocked over. Vessels break. Vessels begin to want." "Want?" Arya repeated, as if testing a strange knife. Jon waited. The hum in the hilt pressed against his palm like a heartbeat. "How many bargains?" he asked. Bran lowered his hand. "The second was after they saw what they had made. They tried to tie it to the earth in 3 places so it could not roam and do as it liked. But a thing that once learns to slip its knots. It learned to move without moving." 3 places, Jon said. His mind laid out the memory of maps like a deck of cards. "Here, the Barrow Sea, and further north." Bran nodded. "A lake that looks like an eye from above, where water remembers glass." Davos grunted.
"Oknoteshonite."
"I've undone worse ones with my teeth." They were not alone in the chamber. Jon sensed the company before the light of the blade found it. A composition of cold so delicate it almost read as warmth until the brain corrected itself. The white at the lip of his vision resolved into figures standing not plainly but at the edges, where the cave's curves strained the light. They were tall as men, narrow, their faces narrow too, as if carved to slip easily through the world. They watched, not curious and not indifferent. Their eyes were a blue that was not color so much as a temperature. They held weapons, and the weapons remembered old smelting. When the nearest one tilted its head, the motion had a courtesy in it, like a court bow learned on the wrong continent. "Move," Jon said, voice low, and the others shifted without panic, forming that little hedgehog of men that experience makes. No one's back exposed, no one crowding another's reach, Bran at the center of what space they could make. The nearest of the tall figures rasped the blade it carried once along the cave floor. The sound raised the hair on Jon's arms. The blade left a thin white track in the stone like frost pulled into a line by a string. Another of the figures tilted its head in the opposite direction and stepped forward 1 pace, the kind of pace a man makes in a dance when the music tells him he should be somewhere else soon. Jon's blade brightened unbidden. The red pulse along it beat once, twice, and steadied. "Sam," Jon said without taking his eyes from the nearest of them. "Don't run." "I'm not," Sam said, sounding like a man reminding himself how to stand up. The first one came. It came with the economy of a craftsman who has no reason to rush, a slow, certain stroke that held within it the memory of speed. Jon met it. The blades touched and the cave flashed white that resolved instantly into clean edges. The sound traveled along Jon's forearm and nested in his teeth. For an instant the world narrowed to that contact. Blue cold and white cold, wanting to learn each other's names. Jon stepped inside the second stroke and cut at the thing's wrist, and when his blade bit, there was a splintering that smelled faintly of salt and old rain. The hand fell, blade and all, and lay on the stone making a small, interesting sound like water freezing. The thing did not cry out. It tilted its head again, examining the hand on the floor, and then looked up at Jon with no expression Jon's mind could translate. It lifted its other hand and John cut that one too, because sometimes the only mercy is swiftness. Behind him, steel met blue and sang again. Arya moved just beyond his shoulder like a second thought turned into intention. Her small blade a quick punctuation in the long sentence of the fight. Davos's breathing was a steadying instrument. Tormund's laugh, when he made it, was an ugly comfort, a noise that told John that someone nearby still had use for such things. Sam's voice came once, a thick exhale as he thrust and connected with something that gave way and broke in a rain of bright shards. When the first of the tall figures broke, it did so all at once, like glass that has waited for the right note and then remembered to shatter. The fragments did not skitter. They lay where they fell, becoming frost. A small wind ran through the chamber without a source. John felt it go past him and out along the corridor they had come, as if it were looking for a door. The other figures did not retreat and did not advance. They angled their heads incrementally, tiny adjustments, and then began to move sideways, arranging themselves around the chamber at exact intervals as if to tune it. "They're setting the room," Davos said, his voice a new shape of dread. Arya's hand found John's sleeve and tugged once, scarcely a touch. "Don't let them finish," she whispered. John understood without the need for explanation. Some rooms make outcomes in the way some weather makes ice. He stepped forward toward the nearest of them, and the sword in his hand leaped in a way he had not taught it, an eager animal scenting the shape of prey. He let it drag him half a pace and then checked it. Not yet, not on impulse. The red ran along the white like breath through a sleeping chest. He cut, not at the thing's center but at the place where its cold touched the stone. The blade bit the seam and the figure above wavered, its outline lost for an instant as if a mirage were forgetting what to imitate. The hum rose, pleased or determined, or some third thing for which men do not have a word. They fought in a discipline that had nothing to do with drill and everything to do with memory. The body's memory of hardship, the mind's memory of necessary kindness, the soul's memory of a debt that will not be paid by coin. The room filled with white. The white found seams. The seams parted. Behind them, the skulls smiled down from the shelf like mothers who have learned that worry changes nothing and love changes everything, and still they do both. When the last of the tall figures broke, it did so at the edge of John's reach. The shards gave off small darts of pale blue that expired before they could find a home. The quiet that followed had a texture, like cloth held between finger and thumb. John waited for the next thing because the next thing always comes. It did, not from a side passage or a corner, but from the wall itself. The wet stone ahead of them rippled, and a shape leaned out as if surfacing from under thin ice. It had a human outline because that is the outline men see even when the truth is different. Its eyes were older than its face. They were not blue and they were not any color John could name. They were a temperature that forgot to be seen as light. It watched the sword with an attention that made the blade's pulse climb and falter and climb again. John raised the point in greeting because his body had learned courtesy too deeply to drop it even here. The shape did not answer in words. It laid a hand, if hand it was, against the inside of the stone as if to match his gesture. Where its palm touched, the stone went briefly clear and he saw, under the skin of the cave, a river of cold running like a vein. He understood it not with the part of him that makes sentences, but with the part that has always known that a fire can grow wrong. There were knots in the flow, 3 darkened tightenings where the current dragged. The one nearest, barely an arm's length beyond the skin, tightened at their presence and then, subtly loosened, as if a muscle had chosen to unclench after a lifetime. Bran made a sound, a small ah of a student who has turned a page and found the answer he already suspected. "There," he said, "the nearest of them." The shape in the wall changed, not its outline but its weight in the room. The attention shifted, not away but through John, as if taking his measure were no longer required. An image came to him that was not a memory and not a dream. Himself in the Godswood as a boy, falling asleep with his head on Ghost's ribs and a book open on his chest, the words unread but absorbed. Himself on the wall, the wind naming him. Himself under the earth now, the sword making a small trapped day. The images rolled over him like weather, tempting him to see them as a future if he would only step aside. The sword's pulse stuttered. Ghost's breath came slow and steady around the hum, and the hum steadied to meet it. "You can have him again," said a voice that wasn't a voice. The thought came with a smell. Fur and blood and winter sun on snow. It dropped into him with the obviousness of a thing that had always been true. "You can give the light back, and we will give the life you took. The world will end as it would end in any case, but you will have a quiet in your last days. You will not die alone." John accepted the thought and evaluated it as you evaluate a horse you cannot afford. He ran his hand along it, checked its teeth, and set it aside without pretending he could keep it. He did not trust himself to speak. He put the flat of the blade to the wall again, where the knot in the river pulled at the world and pushed. The wall yielded like skin, then like fog, then like the soft interior of old snow. The point of the sword entered the knot, and something in the cave changed direction, as if a door that always opened inward had opened outward instead. The shape that had leaned from the wall recoiled without movement. A tightness returned to the air. The passage behind them made a long, distressed sound, as if the stone were remembering water. Arya pressed in at John's shoulder in the little space and kept watch down the way they had come. Davos set his feet and put his back to Bran's chair. Sam's hand went to John's belt as if to anchor him there by human means in case the world forgot how to hold him. John pushed further. The blade did not go deeper like a knife into flesh. It widened like a wedge in a log, making an opening where there had been none. The light traveled along the seam it made and spread in pale veins along the knot until the whole of the tightening shone. A small star trapped in ice. The hum in the hilt reached a frequency John felt in his jaw hinge and behind his eyes, and he let the feeling wash through him. He saw the weirwood in the god's wood with its bleeding eyes and felt sap in his mouth, bitter and sweet. He saw Ghost's red gaze and felt the weight of the wolf's head in the cradle of his hands. He breathed once, and the red along the white answered him. He breathed again, and the knot broke. He did not see it break. He felt the absence like a missing step. The river ran free past the place where it had been cinched. For a moment there was an impression of relief, nothing human, but something like a mountain settling in its bones. Then the cold rushed through the new space and the walls of the cave crackled softly the way glassware cracks in a sudden temperature change. The shape in the wall flinched. Far away, but not too far to reach them, a sound rolled through the earth. Thousands of small falls, not like stones, not like rain, like brittle things remembering they were fragile. John thought in the same instant that outside, between Winterfell's trenches, bodies had shaken themselves apart without being touched. "The Barrow Sea next," Bran said, as if reading a list, though his breath came thinly now. "But he will come. He does not enjoy being made to move." The tunnel did not approve of their success. It drew in around them, ever so slightly, and a fine dust fell like gray snow. John pulled the blade free and the wall closed with an indifference that hurt. The passage back was still there, but it had new turns in it, as if someone had rearranged furniture in a familiar room. They began to move, not quite retreating and not advancing. The sound of the second hazard came on. The channel under the shelf whispering like a creature testing cages in the night. On the shelf, the rope lay coiled. The skulls watched. Across the gap, the black had altered. A faint blue shimmer ran just below the surface of the knot water. John crouched and held the sword out, and the light made a path, temporarily, across the channel, a narrow bridge that existed because something insisted it should. Arya leaped it without waiting. Davos gave the rope a sharp tug and came across like a man returning to a ship from a foolish dock. Tormund laughed and nearly slipped and recovered, swearing at nobody in particular. Sam came last with Bran's chair. Every step a prayer, he forced his way through wordlessly, his lips moving around old syllables no god had earned. They reached, and the channel sighed, disappointed. The hazard that followed had teeth. The teeth appeared slowly from the ceiling, ice forming into points that looked like quills. They lengthened when the blade's light reached them, and turned their points toward the group like flowers tracking the sun. Arya flicked one with a knife, and it fell and shattered harmlessly on the floor, but the mess it made slid toward them like quicksilver finding low places. John held the sword high and the light stiffened, and the growing stopped. The quills retreated grudgingly. They passed under while not looking up, and the quills resumed their slow growth behind, interested in someone else who might come someday and be less careful. They emerged at last into air that had modesty again, air that did not intend to display them to themselves. The mouth of the cave breathed them out with the same patience it had swallowed them with. The snow beyond was blind with daylight. John squinted and the world came back like a body waking from a fever, awkward at the joints, uncertain in its balance. The sword's light, suddenly extravagant in the open, shrank into itself again and learned to be a sword in daylight. The first thing John noticed about the surface was the sound. It had changed since they had gone below. The wind was the same, but there was a new music in it, a thin shattering spread across miles. It came from the south and from the east, as if the crack they had made under the earth was being echoed in 20 places by brittle things failing at the same moment of stress. John did not allow himself to call it hope. He called it weather. The word was safer. They made a fast camp in the lee of a rock shoulder. Not because they needed it, but because men's hands want work when their minds have been used too hard. Davos lit a small, reluctant fire, and they held their hands above it with the greed of men who have forgotten what warmth is and then remember. Bran slept with his eyes closed and his hands quiet. Arya sat apart on her heels and cleaned her blade with the meticulousness of a person resetting a meditation. Sam made an inventory out loud because his mind turned from terror to lists as a way of being kind to itself. Tormund tore a piece of dried meat with his teeth as if it had offended him. John took himself a little way off and stood with the sword point sunk an inch into a fold of old snow. He was not cold and he did not feel warm. He felt precisely measured, as if someone had fitted a ring gauge to his life. The blade pulsed against his palm, and the measure slipped half a mark, then returned to its original place. The breath he heard was not wind. It was the dogged, unshowy sound of a living creature resting without fear. He closed his eyes, and let it pass through him. When he opened them, he found Arya watching him. He did not ask how long she had been there. That was not the kind of question that helped. "We should move before dark," she said. "We should," he agreed. He looked south toward Winterfell. The sky above the line of the walls was bruised by smoke and dragonfire, a discoloration that rose and spread like a lesson. He saw in his mind's arithmetic the way the dead would have moved, and how the line would have flexed where Brienne stood, and where Grey Worm's discipline would hold like a knot in a rope. He saw Sansa's hand on the horn, and the messenger boy's thin legs, and Gendry's fire making no impression on the winter except the small human impression it must. He felt, in his wrist bones, the place where the line had buckled when the knot in the river broke under the earth, and then righted itself. He hoped the men had noticed. Men fight better when the world admits it can be moved. They went, and the day went with them. The land between the cave and the Barrow Sea was older than commandments. It held old burns and old mendings, long shelves of stone where once a glacier had set down its load and been forgiven. The barrows themselves rose like the backs of sleeping cattle under snow, a low quilted country with its own memory of weight. As they approached, the sky took on a faint color at the edges of things, a pale blue that clung to outlines the way reverence clings to old doors. John could feel the hair on his forearms lifting under his sleeves. The blade's hum deepened and then found a groove and settled in it as if resting a wheel in a worn rut. Here the dead stood in rows. They did not move. They were arrayed like soldiers fallen asleep at their posts and petrified there. Their eyes were closed. Frost knit their lids together. Some clasped spears that had grown coral spines of ice along the shafts. Some simply stood with hands at their sides like men in a chapel waiting for a bell to sound. The quiet among them was not the cave's quiet. It had a little human in it, the remnant of intention hardening into habit. Sam cleared his throat once, and it sounded monstrously loud. "They're bound," he whispered. "To the knot." Bran nodded. "If you cut the knot, you cut the leash they have made for themselves." "How many go loose if we do it wrong?" Davos asked. "That," Bran said, "is why we will do it right. The knot showed itself as a place where the barrow mounds made a ring around a depression filled with the palest ice John had ever seen. It was not clear. It had the opacity of milk with water in it. In the center of the depression, raised slightly above the surrounding ice, a smooth protrusion rose, listless as the humped back of a creature that had chosen to sleep even while standing. John stepped down into the depression, and the air put its hands on his head with the grave curiosity of an ant. He set the sword's point against the smooth rise and did not push. He listened. He listened with his palm and with the hand that did not touch the weapon, and with his teeth and his wrist, and with the part of him that had learned to hear ghosts pause on snow behind him even when there had been 20 other sounds closer. The thing beneath his hand was a tightened note. It wanted to sound. It had wanted to sound for longer than he had been alive. He did not need to force it. He needed to ask it the right question. "What did they make you for?" he said aloud, because sometimes questions are keys and keys do not mind being heard. The hum responded, not like language but like a man swallowing and finding his throat clear. John felt the red along the white gather itself for a breath and release it. He pushed. The blade went in as it had before, widening the path rather than making a depth. The ice, milk ice, bone ice, old ice, opened with a modest reluctance and then acknowledged him. The knot loosened. The depression exhaled. The dead in their rows sighed like grain in a field when wind remembers it exists. Not all fell. Some stepped. John tightened his grip and lifted the blade high. The first of them who came toward him had been a boy in life, not much older than the lads who ran messages in the yard. His hair lay under a frosting of rime like a black thread under sugar. He opened his eyes, and there was nothing in them but the task of his body to move forward. John cut, and the boy fell and lay as if remembering how to be still. The others hiccuped, the faintest stutter in their motion, as if the instructions written into their ice had been smudged by rain. They moved quickly on the far side of the depression, severing the knot's last strands and forcing the room of the world to adjust to new geometry. Over the Barrow Sea, a rippling began, a pattern of collapses spreading out like cracks in a pane of frozen milk. Far away, under Winterfell's blue sky, men gaped as their nearest enemies simply fell into themselves and were done. He felt it as much as saw it. The relief went out and then was checked hard, strangled behind a hand. The old cold recoiled and arrayed itself. The figure with the indifferent crown, wherever it stood, in cave or storm or room without doors, turned and set its mind. "We have woken him," Bran said in his plain voice. "He is no longer content to let the knots hold while he keeps accounts. He will come with his ledger and show us our sums." "Let him," Arya said. The dead who had not fallen did not continue their patient parade. They stopped where they stood, and on the far side of the Barrow Sea a line reformed. Not a row this time, but a curve, like a lip pulled back over teeth. The air trembled. Cold came down as if someone had shaken a tablecloth made of winter. John planted the sword point first in the milky ice, and the ripple broke around it the way a river breaks around a rock that remembers more than a stream. The red along the white climbed into a hard glow and steadied. They had few men and fewer certainties. They chose a high place among the barrows where the snow had drifted into shoulders and left the top scoured, and they stood on that scoured ground and made a small, decided posture there. The first ranks of things that were not men but had been stood and looked up at them and then did not look at them at all, because the thing that led them chose not to notice the people when it could notice the blade. It arrived without preface, the way a storm arrives in a country that knows storms. One moment the sky was itself, the next it wore a new face. The figure from the field came over the barrows, not walking and not floating, its feet touching snow when snow wanted them and not when it did not. It looked like a man in a crown whose points were not ornament but ripples in the air where cold had learned to be sharp. It held a long spear. The head of the spear was the color of new ice and older bones. The shaft was almost nothing at all, a memory that had a handle. When it stopped, it tilted its head the way the lesser shapes had, but with purpose. It had measured them already, and now it was testing whether its measure needed adjusting. John did not speak. Speech felt like ducks on a summer pond. Pleasant, absurd, absent. He lifted the white blade and felt the red inside it lift too, as a vein lifts under a thumb. The hum rose until it left sound and entered a realm where music measures distance rather than time. The figure moved. It did not waste motion. It did not begin with feints or with an elegant circle that would let each combatant declare his lineage and his manners. It covered the ground between them in half the time John's mind predicted, and the spear came not for his chest or throat but for the wrist that held the blade, because the thing that wore a man's shape had the economy of old experience. John moved his wrist before the spear reached it. The blade met the spear and the air tasted like pennies crushed between teeth. The ice head of the spear did not shatter. The blade did not falter. They pressed and lifted and pressed again, and the press was like a conversation between two men who admit they will not agree and yet cannot be rude. Arya flickered at the edge of John's vision, searching for a seam. Davos set his weight to be between Bran and what might come from the left. Sam breathed in steady numbers, filling his chest with borrowed courage and then making it his own by use. Tormund huffed once, scornful, because most of his ants had been worse to fight than this pretty figure, and then he widened his stance just enough to show that he understood that contempt was an old friend who could put a knife in your back if not watched. The figure tested, and then decided testing was not required. It twisted the spear and snow leapt from its head like spray from a bow. John stepped inside the twist and cut down, and the blade kissed air where a shoulder had offered itself an instant before. The spear came up for his thigh and he let his leg simply not be there and returned a very small, very precise stroke at the place where the spear met the air. Contact. The room changed. A weight left and a different weight arrived. The figure adjusted a measure. The pulse along the blade warmed. The cold in John's teeth deepened. The spear darted for his face, and for a heartbeat he saw the end of it very close, a docile blue, a color that should belong to a summer fruit and did not. He twisted, saw Arya's eyes through the spear's transparency, and cut. The spearhead split, not centrally but with a small, eccentric fracture that made the break sing. The figure's stillness altered. Not surprise, some other accounting. It stepped back half a pace, almost a courtesy, and made a gesture with its free hand that was as much dismissal as command. The barrow sea moved. The still dead stepped and stumbled and fell and rose in a new order. Not rows, not curves. A composition John could not read in a glance. They made themselves into a pattern that would have mattered if he had not been holding the blade that mattered more. The figure came again, and the air around it shook its head, no, at every other thing for miles. John met it. The blade and spear found they had learned each other and reduced the inefficiencies of strangers. He parried and cut and took a step to the left that belonged to a man he had once trained with and had not liked and had nevertheless known to be right about that step. The red along the white lifted. The white carried the red as a river carries silt from a mountain and makes a new land downriver. He believed, for an instant that lasted exactly as long as an instant must, that he would win, that he would cut the spear and then the hand and then the head and the crown would break and it would be done. The thought was so bright it felt like rescue. It wasn't, because the figure changed its mind about what it was. It stopped being a shape that fought and became a place. The air around John went tight and small, as if he had rushed up a stairwell and found the door at the top locked. Cold came in from 4 directions, and the 5th direction he had once thought was always open. The one a man carries inside himself, narrowed like an eye closing against light. He could not breathe for half a breath and then remembered how because his body remembered how. The blade's hum dropped to a low, approving grind. The red inside it flared so fiercely, he thought he would see it through his glove. Now, Arya said from somewhere he could not see. He did not ask what. On a field, if you must ask what, it is already too late. He felt the absence of the spear as it went briefly elsewhere, and he cut where the spear had left room, and the figure that had become a place had to become a shape again in order to retreat, and in becoming a shape it became a thing a blade could address. He addressed it. The edge bit near the base of the crown, that place where the points join the band, which is always a weakness, and the room made a sound like water remembering sand. Staggered. That is, it did a thing that was not its habit. The crown did not fall. A piece of it peeled away with a reluctance that reminded John of bark from a frost-killed tree. The piece fell in a small white arc and struck the milky ice and made a sound like light hitting stone. The figure tilted its head again, a little more now, as if the world had gone out of level. The spear reformed in its hand, head grown back, but there was a thin white line around the shaft where John's blade had found a seam in what was supposed to be seamless. Then the weather changed all at once and without consent. The line of the dead broke and ran like spilled beads until whoever counted them would scream. From the south, over the low backs of the barrows, a shadow slid too low and then too high and then exactly where it should be. A dragon, black and alive, writing its opinion on the ground with fire. Drogon came over the Barrow Sea in a long, disciplined scour. Not with indulgent fury, but with the exact murder a smith brings to a bar of metal that will behave because he has told it to. On his back, a woman sat with her hands light on the harness, and her face held the kind of concentration that is indistinguishable from prayer. Daenerys had not been able to stay. If Jon had turned and told her not to come, she would have waited. He had not told her because he did not waste precious truths that way. She had read the sky and the line of rising smoke and the way the dead fell and rose again when something under the earth changed, and she had mounted and come to where her life could be spent accurately. Rhaegal did not come. He had taken a wound at Winterfell that asked him to remain and give his blood to the ground that had fed him. Drogon came because the woman told him to and because he wanted to. The heat she brought made the air around Jon's fight bend in a new way. The figure hated it. The hate did not show on its face because its face had not been made to show such things. The hate showed in the way the air near it tore and mended, as if the world had begun to find it distasteful. It thrust the spear not at Jon now but toward the dragon. The head of the spear lengthened abnormally in the throw, as if distance were not a measure for it. Jon stepped between, not to block it with his flesh but to cut it where it grew long enough to matter. The blade took it, and for the first time in the fight the spear broke along its length in a manner that looked like failing and not like plan. The head spun into the snow and did not melt. It lay there looking ridiculous for a heartbeat and then vanished. Drogon's fire washed over the far ranks of the Barrow dead and turned them to a sudden ash that the wind refused to carry, as if even wind had its scruples. Daenerys banked low, trusting her beast's wingtip as she had once trusted a word, and lifted again, dragging a long brightness over the mounds. The figure raised both hands and the weather poured around them in a shape like a bowl turned upside down. The fire crawled up the rim and then slid down the outside toward elsewhere. Jon stepped nearer and set the blade's point to the bowl's center and the bowl cracked. The fire, relieved of its lie, went where it had wished to go. A sound arrived from nowhere and everywhere. It resembled laughter if laughter had been taken apart and reassembled by someone who disliked it. The figure made a gesture, a dismissal or a promise, and the dead around the Barrow Sea put their heads down as if bearing into a snowstorm. The figure itself withdrew backward along a plane the eye could not name. It was gone, and yet the weather of it remained. Twice, Davos said, because saying numbers in order is a kind of providence. We've cut two. What keeps the third? Distance, Bran said, opening his eyes. And a color. The lake is further than our feet and nearer than our breath. It is north. It is the habit of winter to whisper to itself. It is the place where men teach their sons to stay away because their fathers taught them that, and those fathers were right. Then we go, Arya said with an impatience that rejected ceremony. Not all, Jon said. He climbed the small barrow above them carefully, like a man walking behind an old horse, and looked south again. The smoke above Winterfell spread thinly, not the wild smoke of a city catching, but the controlled smoke of defenses burning what they chose. The wind carried a taste of iron on it that had nothing to do with blood. He has changed, Jon thought of the thing with the spear. He has been forced to number us differently. That would make him rude or cautious, and either would change the night's arithmetic. He turned and found Daenerys standing in the shallow of Drogon's shoulder, one hand on the ridge of neck, eyes still on the pattern of the dead. Her hair had frozen at the ends into frail white tassels. Her cheeks were not red. Her eyes had a steadiness in them he had become familiar with, the steadiness of a person who is looking at a map no one else can see and is concentrating on not reading it aloud. She looked at the blade and then at him. "What did it cost?" she asked simply, as if costs were items to be marked down and reckoned humanely. "What it cost," he said. The answer did not satisfy her because answers do not satisfy the part of a person that has thought too much about right action. She nodded anyway and looked past him to Bran. "What will it cost next?" "Not you," Bran said, and she held his gaze without the courtesy most people extend to children. "Make sure of that," she said. They set out with the light falling away from the day like a shawl slipping. The north showed its old face, stone and sweep and white distance that mocked careful men. The path that was not a path bent to the right and then the left as if to test their patience and found it adequate. The cold made a different choice every mile. Now full of needles, now heavy, now a glass a man could walk out onto and forget that glass breaks. They slept in brief, accurate portions. Davos's snores argued with Tormund's. Arya slept with her eyes shut and her hand open on her knife as if encouraging it to trust her. Sam woke every hour with a list on his lips and went back to sleep after confirming the list was unnecessary. Bran dozed with his head tilted at a slight angle the way birds do when they are listening. Jon's sleep was a series of doors he stepped through and stood behind without closing. He dreamed once that he was in the crypts. He moved past the king's faces, wolves, men, some neither, and he came to a niche that had not been there before. There lay a wolf not as large as he remembered, and the fur was not as white, and yet it was ghost. He was not dead and he was not alive. He watched Jon with one eye, and the other eye was a mirror. Jon looked into it and saw himself older or younger or truer. He lifted a hand and touched the glass of the eye and his fingers came away wet, and in waking his hand still felt damp, and the blade's hum sat deeper in his palm. The lake showed itself the way deer show themselves to the patient. All at once after hours of there being nothing to see. The surface was not blue or white. It was colorless in a way that made the things around it seem garish, as if the lake disapproved of the sky's habits. Snow did not lie near it. The air above it had a faint trembling, as if it remembered heat but would not admit it. The shape was round, too round for chance, an eye set down where no animal could own it. The knot here was not a knot like the others. It was an absence in the center, a hole that looked like a circle of deeper lake. Jon stood at the shore and tasted the wind. The taste was faintly SW. The way an apple is sweet even when it is not eaten. He stepped onto the ice and the ice did not accept him at first. It needed to learn him. He let it. He kept the blade low and quiet as if soothing an animal. The light sank into the ice and did not return. He felt the milk cold of the Barrow Sea and the skin cold of the cave and something older than both. A winter that is patient, a long, polite disease of the world from which the world does not recover but learns to live despite. At the center of the lake, the hole proved to be not depth but smoothness, a patch of ice without grain. He stood upon it and the blade made his breath into light. He looked into the ice and saw, for an instant, himself as he might have been had he ridden south with Robert and never taken the black, had he stood in rooms with tapestries instead of on walls with ravens, had he been bored sometimes and content sometimes and never any of the things he had had to be. He looked away and the world steadied. Bran came beside him, chair feeling absurd and necessary on the slick. Arya stood just behind, weight on the balls of her feet in case the ice chose to fail. Sam hovered with a rope in his hand he had not realized he had picked up. Davos put a hand flat on the ice as if appreciating a fine hull. Tormund peered down and snorted at whatever kind of beauty a lake thinks it has. Jon set the point of the blade to the smooth. The hum came up into his bones and settled there as if he were being used as a resonant space. The red ran along the white in a thread so fine it made him think of veins in a lover's wrist. He remembered Ghost's breath, and the memory responded, present as pain. He pushed. The smoothness did not open. It lost an argument with itself. It became less smooth at the margins first, as if the idea of being perfect could not hold when a different idea insisted. Then the center grew a hairline fissure that absorbed light like a mouth absorbing breath. He widened it with pressure and with attention. He thought the name of the wolf because sometimes names are bridges. The fissure took the name and gave nothing back. Then it widened and let go. The knot unknotted. The lake exhaled like a sleeping giant turning against a hill. The sound rolled out across the north and came back from the mountains, complicated with echoes that did not belong to mountains. The air around them changed. Not warmer, not kinder, but less sure of its inevitability. All across the remembered maps, things fell down and did not get up again. At Winterfell, between trenches gone black with dragon fire and the stubborn white lines men had built and held, 1,000 bodies simply ceased to believe in themselves. Grey Worm stood and watched an enemy he had thought he would never defeat by skill fall as if pushed by a god he did not worship, and he let out a single breath that was almost laughter. Sansa put her hands on the parapet and bowed her head, and her mouth moved and no sound came out. Gendry put his hammer down and leaned his forehead on the handle and said aloud to no one that he was very tired. Daenerys wheeled above the yard and saw that the pattern in the press had changed in a way that was not random, and she lifted Drogon's large head with her hands and made a sound that meant, "See." On the lake, the ice went mad for a moment, checking whether it was permitted to be stable. Jon knelt to persuade it. He put his free hand flat and held the blade just barely in contact with the center and breathed in slow fives. The ice accepted the compromise not from love, but because it could do nothing else if it wanted to remain ice. "That will make him very angry," Bran said, with the polite interest of a child observing a teacher's temper from the back of a room. "He'll be thin," Davos said hopefully. "Anger makes men forget to eat." "He will be what he is," Arya said. He came. He did not come like a storm this time. He came like a man walking into his own house and finding strangers sitting at his table not eating. The air went still in the way air does when it listens. He stood at the edge of the smoothness and looked at Jon and then at the blade and then at the thin line where the ice had accepted change and not rebelled. He tilted his head a little, tired of tilt, and the crown's missing sliver showed a white imperfection along his brow. It was different this time. He did not bring a spear. He brought his hands together in an old gesture that resembled prayer, and then he set them apart and a long blade formed between them, something that was neither sword nor wind, a visible absence, a negative of a blade that would occupy the space where a blade should be. Jon lifted the white with the red in it, and it hummed a note that startled gulls off a cliff miles away. They met. There was no first cleverness, no step to show that one of them knew a trick the other did not. They came together like answers. The world remembered it had bones. Jon found that he had been taught this fight before, not by men, not by steel, by loss. The red answered him when his resolve faltered and withdrew when pride reached for it. The white cut absence and produced presence. Where it passed, frost cracked, and the cracks made tiny notes of relief. The crown's wearer adjusted and adjusted again, finding new measures and new rages, and each time Jon refused to be the measure and refused to be the rage. He was not an answer. He was a hand holding a particular tool in a particular history, and he continued. He felt the moment when it turned. They always do. It is the small humiliation that ends a long humiliation. The blade in the figure's hands hesitated, not because its master chose badly, but because the world it had been made to dominate had been taught 3 new words it could not unlearn. Jon stepped into that half-beat as if he had been waiting for it all his life and had never known it. He cut at the wrist, and the wrist was no longer immune to the habit of breaking. He cut at the throat, and the throat was not a throat, but it remembered that throats are vulnerable when interrupted. He cut at the crown, and the crown, already compromised, had learned self-doubt. The crown split not cleanly but with the reluctance of an old tyrant being told a long story about why his law no longer functions. The figure staggered for the second time in 2 days. In the same instant there came a pressure against Jon's back so familiar, he nearly turned as if to scold a friend for jostling him. He did not turn. He cut again. The blade went through the center of the figure's head with the gentle accuracy of a midwife's hand. There was no scream. There was a soft, almost obscene noise, like the breath a child makes when milk goes down the wrong way and then rights itself. The figure's face forgot it had been made. It reassembled into a confusion of cold and curved away from explanation. Collapsed. The collapse was quiet and endless. It went on longer than its cause. The air above the lake rose and then settled and then found it was wrong and rose again. The ice beneath John's feet grew a fine filigree of cracks and then, obeying the daily kindnesses of the world, did not break. He stepped back without hurrying and the white blade came with him and did not argue. Around the rim, the dead stopped being dead in that way. They froze, not with the old theft but with the honesty of weather. They leaned into the wind and became nothing anyone could summon. Far south, under the walls of Winterfell, a quiet fell so sudden that men raised their hands to their ears. Then the wind returned and with it the small necessary sounds. The creak of leather, the cough of a man who has remembered his lung, the clink of a dropped knife. Sansa let her hands fall from the parapet. Her knuckles were white. She took a breath that was not an argument with herself and looked at the long yard where she had made shapes out of men and women, and at the pyres not yet lit, and at the dragon hanging above them like a question answered for the moment. She turned and walked down the stair to the yard and began to ask about water and bandages and food because victory, if it came, would demand those too. On the lake, Jon stood over what he had made and did not call it victory. The absence on the ice had no piece he could point to with satisfaction. It spread like fatigue and then halted at the line where the blade had decided to be sufficient. He lowered the point and the light withdrew politely into the edge. The hum fell back to the place where it could be mistaken for his own heart if he wanted that kindness. He did not take it. Bran breathed out and closed his eyes and opened them again. Not the end, he said, but a joint, a hinge. Davos scratched his cheek with the back of his glove. I've always liked a door that opens, he said, even if it opens on another door. Arya tiptoed forward, not because she feared making noise, but because she did not want to be rude to the space. She crouched and put 2 fingers on the ice where the figure had fallen. Her mouth twitched. Cold, she said with interest. Different cold. Jon nodded. He could feel it in the bones of his feet, the newness. The winter had not ended. The world had not learned a gentler habit. But something that had believed itself permanent had been taught to doubt. That kind of teaching travels. They went back the way they had come, and the way had the decency not to change while they weren't looking. The lake watched them leave with its colorless eye. The air made room for their heads and their small news. Jon did not quicken his pace and did not linger where his mind wanted to set small shrines to the differences he had made. He walked as he had walked 1,000 other miles for smaller wins and smaller losses, 1 foot, then the other, each an argument and an agreement. Winterfell received them without ceremony. It had learned in the last days that ceremony wastes the time of the living. Men lifted their heads and then lowered them again to tasks that would let them keep lifting their heads. Sansa stood at the gate with ash on her cheek that no one had told her was there. She did not run and she did not let her face soften until Jon had stepped inside and the old stone and the newer snow were between him and everything else. "Report," she said, because language keeps people upright. "We made 3 cuts," Jon said. "He fell in one of them. He may rise in another, but he will rise less confidently. The dead fell by the thousands. The rest lost their appetite." She nodded and looked past him at the others, counting by habit, noticing who had more blood on their cloak than seemed reasonable, who was walking with a new economy that might become a limp tomorrow. She touched Jon's sleeve briefly, as if testing the fabric. "Eat," she said. "Then tell me where we must break him next." Daenerys slid down Drogon's shoulder with the grace of a woman who has learned how to dismount grief. She walked to Jon as if walking across a court to speak to a rival who is also her brother and also her enemy and also her friend. Her eyes went to the blade. She held out a hand toward it without touching. It warmed her skin without burning it. She pulled her hand back and opened and closed it once, testing her tendons like a swordsman. "How many more bargains must you make?" she said in a voice without ornament. "No new ones," Jon said. "Only the ones already made." He meant Ghost. He meant the Weirwood. He meant all the men and women who had stood at gates while other men went under earth to make changes men cannot make in the light. He meant the door that turned on its hinge and the next door after. They burned the dead who deserved burning and left the ones who were only ice to return to their element. The pyres sang their old song without shame. Men spoke small words over the fire because small words are more honest near flames. Sam found a bench and sat and fell asleep with his finger marking a page he had not been able to finish. Davos drank water with a seriousness that made even water feel less common. Arya went and stood in the godswood and said nothing to the tree, which is the only obligatory courtesy that tree understands. Jon went to the place where they had left Ghost. Snow had covered the fur, drawing a clean sheet over a reality that had needed a softer line. He knelt and brushed the snow away from the head and the neck, and the cold that clung to the fur did not argue with his touch. The sword's hum eased, not louder and not softer, but more present, as if it had accompanied him to a room where polite people do not shout. He set the blade across his knees and put his hand on Ghost's cheek and closed his eyes. He did not ask forgiveness. Forgiveness is a bridge that takes you to the opposite shore and abandons you there with no boat. He asked simply to be allowed to keep what the act had been for. The world declined to comment. A small wind passed under the red leaves and they made their soft iron music. Somewhere beyond the gate, a man laughed because something silly had happened in the yard. A child yelled and was shushed and then laughed again, smaller. The winter listened to itself and decided for the moment to be only winter. The breath that lived inside the blade kept time with Jon's heart, and where their measures did not match they learned how. He rose when he had sat long enough that his knees wanted to complain, and the small complaints of the body seemed a form of loyalty he would not embarrass. He lifted the blade. It had not cooled because it was not warm. It had settled. He carried it out of the trees and into the day he had been given. Men gathered in the hall with the slow relief of soldiers allowed to eat without watching the door. Sansa took a place at the head not because it was hers, but because she had earned it, and no one would be made more comfortable by seeing the chair empty. Daenerys sat not to Sansa's right or left, but at a third place, just behind, a triangle that suggested geometry and wore both. Bran was placed where his eyes could do their work without being asked to do it. Arya sat where she could see the door and the servants come and go and the fire both. They spoke in the measured cadences of people whose throats have learned that fear dries them. The dead would not come in the same numbers again, not immediately. The thing that had led them would need to learn how to be what it was without its faith in itself. It would need to gather the pieces of a crown and test each one to see if it still bent the air. It would need to choose whether to spend itself on revenge or on strategy, and the choice would change how the winter felt in men's bones. Gendry came in with a hand wrapped and soot in his hair and paused when he saw the blade. His face did not open the way some men's faces do near bright things. It settled into a craftsman's quiet. "You'll want a scabbard that won't insult it," he said to Jon. "I will," Jon said, as if asked whether he wanted a cloak in a gale. "We'll make it of what we have," Gendry said. "Not dragonbone. That's a vanity. Leather cured in milk and salt. Bands of iron that's been drunk by fire and exhaled again. A fleece we can't shear twice. It will do." Jon nodded. "It will do." He ate then, because men eat at wars as at weddings if they mean to go on. The stew was onions and turnip and a meat that had known what it was to be stubborn. He tasted it and could have wept with gratitude, not for the taste but for the fact of heat moving from one thing into another kindly. He drank water until the shapes in the room regained their edges. He listened to Sansa ask after small matters, the allotment of oil, the building of a low wall to divert a wind that persisted in making a corner of the yard unpleasant, and felt the kind of hope that is worth a person's life, the hope made out of work. After, he went back to the walls and looked north where the old cold made its bed. He could not see the lake from here, nor the cave, nor any of the invisible things he had cut or made. The blade at his side lay lightly against his thigh, and the red ran along the white in a thread he could feel if he closed his eyes. He did not close them. He watched the sky change its mind about color 3 times in a quarter hour and thought, how tired the world must be to keep doing this and doing it well. Someone stepped up beside him. He knew by the weight of the footfall and the soft gratitude he felt in its familiarity. He did not turn. Arya leaned her elbows on the parapet and looked out as he looked out. "You didn't ask me to stop you," she said. "No," he said. "You knew what I would have said," she said. He nodded. You would have said do it if it must be done, and make sure it matters, and don't make me speak of it again. She smiled, a quick flash of teeth, and then was serious again. You made it matter. For now, he said. That's the only time there is, she said, which he thought was the most truthful thing anyone had said all day. They stood shoulder to shoulder, the way children do without knowing they are making a promise to their future selves. The wind came and went. The cold had manners for the moment. Somewhere behind them a pot lid fell, and someone swore and someone else laughed, and the laugh rang like steel struck properly. Night came slow, as if unsure whether it was welcome. The stars showed and were not proud. John stayed until his breath made little flags in the air, and the blade's hum was the only drum he needed. He thought of Ghost's breath, and then he did not think of it, not to spare himself, but to ask the memory to stop being useful and return to being simple. The memory obeyed with a grace that surprised him. He went to bed for an hour because men who never sleep die as thoroughly as men who sleep too long, and he wanted to be prepared to die properly if he must. He dreamed of a door that opened in both directions. On one side, a hall made of wood and smoke and old stories. On the other, a field of snow with wolf tracks leading away into a line of dark trees. He stood with one hand on the latch, and the latch was warm, and the warmth was a comfort that did not promise anything else. He woke with the taste of sap in his mouth and the memory of a laugh he had not heard for years. The blade lay where he had placed it, slightly open to the room, as if listening for footsteps. Before dawn, a rider came from south along the King's Road with a banner half-rolled and a face like a man who has seen too many camps. He brought word of movement at the neck, and of men who had refused winter's orders and chosen to march anyway. He brought news of a house John had never expected to be grateful for offering spears. He brought a letter sealed with wax that had been too cold to impress cleanly. Sansa broke it and read and let out her breath in a way that made the paper move the tiniest fraction, and then handed it to John. It said little, and what it said twice, once in plain words and once in the choice of those words. Men would come. Food would come. A lord who had once hated Starks had found he disliked extinction more. A woman who had once thought dragons were stories had sent wool and salted fish and had written please as if the word hurt her, and she was glad of the pain. The world was changing around the hinge they had made, not as an answer and not as a reward, but because when you move a door, everything in the room must accommodate. John closed his hand around the note and felt the blade's hum agree that paper matters because men agree it does. He nodded to Sansa and she nodded back, and that exchange was more binding than most treaties written with better ink. By the the sun had lifted itself the height of a pike above the horizon. The yard was a geometry of practice again. Men learning to step where their teachers told them to step. Boys discovering they could hold a spear without their hands going numb. Women showing other women how to use a knife on something besides a turnip without teaching the knife to know too much. The dragons went up and down like particular weather. Bran sat in the godswood and did his arithmetic among the leaves. Arya went through a series of movements with two blades that looked like a dance and was not. Davos argued gently with a man from a fishing village about the use of a net in winter, and won because he had hands that had known rope longer. Sam read until his whole face softened, and then he went to the kitchens and told them something about boiling water and salt that made their work easier, and no one thanked him because the best thanks is having the thing you said done without anyone making a fuss of you. John walked the wall again and again until his feet carried him there without asking. He stood with the blade at his side and watched weather, and the weather watched him back in its blind way. He did not imagine he had saved any world. He had not saved even this holdfast. He had made it possible to try again tomorrow. He had taught the cold doubt. He had given the living a day they had not expected to see. He stood and let that be what it was. When the first scouts came in near dusk with their faces more weary than the horses and their news was not perfect but was better than yesterday's, he smiled without his face hurting. He looked up at the bruised sky, and for an instant he thought he saw a pale shape moving at the edge of the yard. Not wolf and not wind. A suggestion of a friend stepping out of a room without a door. He did not turn his head for fear of making it work too hard to be seen. He kept his gaze on the horizon and said, as softly as a man speaks to a sleeping child, "Stay near." The hum answered him with the steadiness of breath. The red inside the white lifted and fell. The world breathed with him, in that difficult, willing way that makes a life. He stayed at the wall until true night came, and then he went to do whatever he had promised next. And the blade went with him, and the next door waited to be found.